Good morning or good afternoon to all my colleagues who are attending the refresher course here. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the refresher course to give me an opportunity to talk to you about this topic, language, pedagogy, assessment, and policy. What do we look for in a topic like this? So what we are going to do is we are going to take up three major themes in this. First of all, we want to situate language in education. Where do we find language in education? When we talk about education, where does language appear? How do we situate it into the whole scenario of education discourse? Then the second thing which we are going to discuss about is, and this is going to be a very major theme here, we are going to talk about pedagogy and assessment, which are the two very major dimensions, not the only dimensions in terms of teaching and learning discourse, but these are the two very major dimensions on which any disciplinary area is based. So apart from pedagogy and assessment, which are interlinked with each other in many different ways, we are also going to see the third major theme, how it reflects in NEP 2020. We are specifically going to take up this policy because we do not have that much time to discuss in the other policies how these two, pedagogy and assessment of any disciplinary area, have been taken forward. So in NEP 2020, we want to see how pedagogy and assessment of language reflects in the pedagogical perspectives that are taken up in the in this document of NEP 2020. The three major questions that we take up within this sub-theme are, what do the key terms reflect? So there are a lot of key terms which keep appearing frequently in the document. For example, mother tongue, for example, local language. So what do they reflect? What do the major discourses say? So for instance, there is a very major discourse on multilingualism. Now, why does multilingualism appear there? And what exactly does it say about our pedagogy, about what we really want to envisage as a part of our policy, and then how do we take it back to our pedagogy and to our assessment? We want to see also, given these kind of key terms and the kind of discourses that we find in NEP 2020, we want to see, does one perspective provide us a better framework to fulfill the aspirations of NEP 2020? So let's move to our first theme, which is situating languages in education. When you talk about language, in contrast to the other disciplinary areas, so for example, if you take mathematics, mathematics is, if I ask what is mathematics, somebody would say numbers, somebody would say timeline, somebody would say algorithm, algebra, trigonometry, calculus. So there would be areas which one can see. When I say language, what comes under language in terms of education? Like, language is something omnipresent. I mean, even if you look at the other domains, the other disciplinary areas, you can see that that language is present everywhere. You cannot ignore the presence of language even in other disciplinary areas. So even if you're talking about sciences, even if you're talking about mathematics, you would see that there is a presence of language everywhere. So it's like omnipresent. Hence, it's very different from the other disciplinary areas. Now, language is also multidimensional. Of course, because it is omnipresent, it is also multidimensional. Language can be seen as a medium. Language can be seen as a discipline in itself. So when you look at language as a discipline, it's like you are talking about language itself. You are talking about, maybe you're talking about literature. When it becomes a discipline, you're using language for a very, very specific purpose. But when we are talking about language as a medium, that's where it becomes, it cuts across the curricula, it cuts across the disciplinary areas. So when you're talking about language as medium, it's not language as such. It's about how do you use language for mathematics? How do you use language for sciences? How do you use language in terms of history? Do they have particular kind of registers in which we talk? Do they have particular kind of genre? Do they have some kind of vocabulary which is specific to these disciplinary areas or even outside? So it's not just limited to education. It is also everywhere, all around us. We are actually made up of language. Then the third thing, language as thought. This is basically very closely linked to language as medium. Since language is a medium, what is it a medium for? It is a medium for communication. Of course, everybody knows that. But it is also a medium of organizing your thoughts. Without language, your thoughts are all mangled up. You cannot express things very clearly. You cannot categorize things because you cannot label them. So language is basically extremely relevant for thought. Now, language is also a very, very strong identity marker. And that's what it's an identity marker for an individual. It is an identity marker for different kinds of groups which exist in the society. And of course, each one of us knows that there are a lot of politics around language. India has at least 14 states which are based simply on language. So you can identify that in this state, this language is spoken. So that becomes an identity marker for the natives of that state. Because it is an identity marker, language is also power. Language is a symbol of power. And we all know the difference of status between English and Hindi. So the term status, when I say that there is a particular status which is linked to somebody who speaks in English, which is linked to somebody who speaks in Hindi, or linked to somebody who speaks in certain kinds of dialects, their language is playing a powerful role. So language is, you can say that language can be identified as power and as identity. Now, coming to the last dimension of language, which is, well, I have put it as capital L and small l. In linguistics, we distinguish between language as a human trait and language as the variety. So to clarify more about it, when you say capital L stands for any human language. So you don't say that Hindi is like this, English is like this. When you say that, it becomes the small l. But when I say human language, when I say that human language has words and sentences, that is true about all human languages. So which means that all the human languages have words, all the human languages have sentences, all the human languages have certain kinds of categories, all the human languages have grammatical categories, they have words, they have sentences which are organized in a specific way. When we talk about languages, those terms without specifying whether it's language A or language B, that's called capital L. Now, having learned about the different dimensions of language, of course, there would be many more, but I have taken these very predominant dimensions of language. We come to then because language is omnipresent, because language is multidimensional, so the policies related to language, actually we shouldn't even be saying policies related to language, we should be saying policies based on language, like multilingualism, mother tongue education, official language, endangered languages. This is foundational to all domains of learning, and we will see how it is reflected in NEP 2020. Hence, anybody and everybody related to education in any disciplinary domain needs to know about the basic language related issues in education. And that's exactly why I made this presentation. Now, moving on to our second major theme. So what goes on in terms of teaching and learning dimension of language? As we said, the two major concepts, ideas, or domains that we are taking in terms of teaching and learning of languages is pedagogy and assessment. Both of these depend on how we perceive language. But first of all, we need to know that they are very much interlinked and they feed into each other. So I cannot say that I teach A, but I assess B. So when I teach A, there is some kind of idea that I have in terms of the assessment. And that's what drives my teaching and learning. That's what drives my pedagogical practices. On the other hand, assessment is driven by what and how something has been taught. So you see that these two are interlinked just like language and thought. Now, there are many theoretical perspectives to understand the nature of language, because what we understand language as will determine what kind of pedagogical routes or approaches we want to take in terms of language teaching and learning, and how we want to assess that learning. So there are a lot of perspectives which have been given at different points of time by different theoreticians. For example, Chomsky. According to Chomsky, the nature of language is such that you cannot teach it. The child acquires it. The child has the whole framework, the blueprint of that in his or her mental structure, mental schema, and that keeps unfolding. So it is something as innate as walking. So talking is innate, just like walking. So the child just crawls at some point of time, and then he or she stands up and starts walking. And nobody teaches the child to walk, according to Chomsky. Similarly, nobody teaches the child to talk. But Skinner, on the other hand, considers language and language teaching as something like a behavior, because, of course, Skinner was a behaviorist, was a very well-known behaviorist. And according to him, language is like any other behavior. You see the others, you see adults around you talking, and the child starts imitating them. First of all, the child comes up with some words, and then the child comes up with combining the words and then making sentences. Whatever sentence or word is accepted by the adults becomes a part of the child's vocabulary and verbal repertoire. Whatever is dissuaded does not become a part of it. That's how Skinner looks at it. Now, a very functionalist view of language is taken by Halliday, and a somewhat different view is taken by Vygotsky. So according to Vygotsky, language is basically very intricately related to our thought, and it shapes or sometimes even determines thought. And you cannot actually, you cannot disintegrate the two after a point of time. Halliday takes a very, very functional view of language, and he does not consider language as a structure. He does not consider language as a behavior. He considers language as something, a system, which grows with the kind of functions that it has to serve for human beings. And there are certain kinds of functions. It's not merely for communication. It is also to extract information, to express yourself, to organize your daily activities, and so on. So these are some of the theoreticians who have put in their ideas on language. What we are taking up here is one extreme view of behaviorist structuralist kind of view, according to which language is a very externally learned behavior, and language itself is a structure. The extreme opposite would be the functionalist constructionist view. So which is at the opposite end of it, which is almost contrary to this, that language is a function, it is constructed by the learner, and it is not learned as a behavior. It is learned to serve certain kinds of functions, not only communication. Of course, there are different versions of these. There are a lot of other kinds of views which fall between these two extremes. But since we do not have that much time, we will not discuss each of these. We'll just discuss the two which lie at the opposite extremes. Now, this I have divided into three parts. When we take up behaviorist structuralist view or the other functionalist constructionist view, we see how looking at that, the basic tenets, what do the basic tenets of a behaviorist structuralist view say about language, and how does it impact the pedagogy related to language, and then also the assessment related to language. So in the behaviorist structuralist view, for example, we see language as an abstract structure which is divided into units or levels, like letters, words, sentences in a hierarchical fashion. So you see that the behaviorist structuralist view takes language as a very clean structure, no disturbances, no noises like the individual subjectivities, etc. This leads us to a bottom-up approach. Bottom-up approach would be where you are starting from the parts and going to the whole. Because you have disintegrated it into levels and units, you can start from the units and go to the whole. So we start from letters and go to words and sentences and so on. A fallout of that in terms of assessment would be that we usually end up with memory-based tasks. You identify some of the things, you identify particular letters, uh, uh, you you identify something like nouns, pronouns, you take different grammatical aspects differently, and something like writing sentences with specific words but with no context given to it, with no reason behind it. Then in this view, language is seen as externally controlled. Like obviously if it is a behavior, it can be externally controlled. And the pedagogical implications. So basically, the pedagogical implications are not exactly corresponding to what the perception is, but I have just jotted down the points. And the bottom-up approach is related to how we move from simple to difficult. Why I put this in commas is that this is supposedly simple and supposedly difficult. So, for example, I would say that the word, something like the word kamal or the word magar, it would be simple for a child than the word magarmach or the word machli, because machli has a matra. Machli has something extra. It is not a simple consonant. It has a vowel with it. Of course, all the words have vowels, but it has a vowel which needs to be written differently with a matra. And such kind of words are considered to be difficult uh, as compared to the words like kamal, which does not carry a matra. Now, the fallout of such kind of perception and such kind of pedagogy would be that often you would end up giving questions without any kind of context, because you have already decided that language consists of abstract units, and you really don't need to get into the details of how any individual perceives it. Then the learner's experience is not considered to be much relevant in this view. There is a separation between the structure and the function. And so first you learn the structure and then you start reading. Then you start making sense of things. So basically you start with something which is meaningless. When I teach a child ka or kha, recognizing ka or kha or p or k, that does not mean anything for a child. What means something for a child is a word or a sentence which is used in a context. But here we are moving from meaningless to meaningful. Language is also considered to be just a means of communication under this approach. Now, the pedagogical implications, more pedagogical implications would be that the child's own understanding and experience is discounted. Individual and cultural factors are sidelined because you are sticking to following a structure. and that structure is abstract. It cannot have the noise from the cultural factors, from the individual factors, etc. It is focused on formal and written form, in the formal context and the written form. That's exactly why in most of the traditional behaviorist structuralist classrooms, you would find a child's home language being pushed away from the classroom. It is often said, don't use this kind of language here, which means that the child is not able to bring a particular kind of language to the classroom because one particular kind of language is more acceptable than the other. Then the impetus is on the written form. And that's why you see most of the classrooms saying, don't talk, do your work. That work is written. So talking is no work. Talking is no pedagogy. Talking does not or cannot lead to anything fruitful. So basically, the written form is in focus. The focus is also on the uniformity of the process and content. Because you have a structure, because you have sidelined the individual and the cultural factors, there will be a uniformity which is being adhered to. And all the learners are supposed to learn that uniform structure. Now, this also assumes a hidden monolingualism. Why so? Because when you are saying that something has to be written in a particular form, something has to be put only in a formal context, and you are keeping home language away, you are keeping cultural factors away, then it certainly leads to it basically is a convergent kind of approach. Whenever it's a convergent kind of approach, we tend to move towards removing the colloquial forms, removing certain kinds of home languages, removing the idiosyncratic expressions that children might have, which might be coming from their home languages. So, in essence, it leads to a kind of monolingualism, even though ideologically we may be saying that we encourage every child's language. Now, the assessment as a result, in the assessment, the experiential basis and subjectivity is minimized. The assessment of grammar and structure is dominating in the questions. Cultural awareness and creativity is there in terms of giving it as a topic, but not, for example, but not for subjective, it's not open to subjectivity. It's not open to individual interpretation. So for instance, if you want a child to write a paragraph on a particular festival, you do not appreciate anybody writing that on that particular festival in year so and so my father passed away, so we do know, for me this festival does not mean anything, or it just reminds me of the sadness and gloom that envelops my family that day. That's not appreciated. Now deviation from the norm is seen as error. So if a child says that in my language Shashi is called Sasi, I mean, I cannot speak Shashi, and the child says Sasi, that is an error, because you are pushing away the form that is there in the child's language. Not much space is there for colloquial expressions as a result. This view also considers language skills as separate. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing are treated as separate clean circles. This is an exercise you do for listening. This is an exercise you do for reading. This is something that you do for writing. So reading is you read a text. Writing is that you write answers to certain kinds of things. You do not write what you have read. You do not write reviews on the basis of what you have read. You do not write what you want to speak. So all of these things are not related to each other. They are separated out. Similarly, grammar and composition are separated out from each other. And this approach also does not really encourage the figurative language use. So figurative language is basically peripheral and anomalous in this. Why? Because we are depending on structure. The core is the structure in this particular view. And figurative language is something which does not follow a lot of structure. Why it does not follow structure is because it does not literally mean what is being said. So when I say दिमाग की दही कर दी, I'm using a Hindi example. I can also use an English example. So for example, I say that somebody is the apple of my eye. So it does not literally mean, it's not a combination of the words that form it. Nobody can be somebody's apple of the eye, literally. It has to be a figurative meaning. And many studies indicate that there is a lot of figurative language we use even younger children. But this approach, because it is based on a strict structural regime, it does not allow something which is not literal. So the pedagogical implications of this are that language skills are taught separately, speaking and writing are disjointed, for example. A grammar is disjointed from the overall comprehension of the text. It's very often heard, we will improve the grammar once the child starts writing something. And we do not realize that we speak and write with grammar. We cannot write or speak or say anything in language without grammar. Idioms and metaphors are treated as separate from the literal text. So the figurative language is basically a kind of ornament. It's very ornamental. It's not a part of regular language use. The assessment on the basis of these pedagogical implications, the assessment is based on very limited functions of language. Grammar is assessed separately from the text. Metaphor, idiom, and other non-literal components form a minimal part of assessment. Now we will move on to the next approach, which is function-based constructionist approach, which is kind of contrary to this. So where we are taking language as an abstract structure in behavior, in a behaviorist approach, we are taking here language as a socio-political, cognitive, and cultural function of both the individual and the society. So basically, language is a function, language is a system which is very integrated and intricately related to the society, how the society functions, how the culture functions. So everything is intricately related to each other. There is also a relationship between language and thought which is intricate. So you see that there is a bit of Vygotskian framework coming in here, because he considers that language and thought are very intricately related. Now, the pedagogical implications of this would be that we adopt a top-down approach. A top-down approach is in contrast to a bottom-up approach, where we saw that we start from letters and then we go to words and then we go to the whole text. In this approach, we start from something which is much more meaningful for the learner. Now, for instance, starting with a story, with sharing children's experiences, with a narrative, that's a whole. And then you come down to what kind of words have been used. Then the children, maybe if they read out those words. So you start with stories, you start with poems, you start with rhymes, you start with the kinds of games they play and the words they use in those games. That would be a top-down approach. The focus here is on meaning making instead of getting down to the structure. The assessment, and here I would mean an ideal assessment, because we don't have time later on, so we can discuss it here itself, that assessment is often, so sometimes it's not related to the kind of pedagogy that we are adopting in the classroom. So we work usually on pedagogy, but assessment is something which is often ignored. So whatever constructive and creative pedagogy you use in the class, you still have to stick to the same kind of assessment which has been used from since many years. Now, assessment ideally in this kind of scenario, in this kind of framework, should be based on contextualized tasks. There is space for subjective and experiential tasks. And so, for example, a child can write, "My first day in the school" is something that is given usually, but a usual answer is also expected. Here you give space to the child to come up with their own real authentic expressions, their real authentic experiences. Focus on assessing a variety in expression and form. So since you are giving space to the child, there would obviously be a variety in terms of expression and the form also, because we are not focusing on structure. Now, if we look at it carefully, multilingualism is a norm in this kind of approach. Why it is a norm? Because we are not talking about a specific structure. When we are talking about a specific structure, that means we are also taking up a specific language. Since we are talking about function and every child might function in a different language, multilingualism automatically becomes a norm under this approach. Structure and function are integrated with each other. You do not separate them out like you first study the structure and then we apply it somewhere. It is for the function that the structure is used. It does not treat different linguistic levels as separate. So, of course, we do get down to words, we do get down to letters, but we are not practicing letters and we are not memorizing words separately in under this approach. The pedagogical implication obviously is that multilingual approach is used for teaching. The variation of cultures, languages, linguistic context is a part of the curriculum and pedagogical practice in this particular approach. Here we assume, as I just elaborated, here we assume that the structure arises out of use, but it does not regulate it. So it's not like that there is a structure and using that structure, you would apply it for some kind of function. So basically what you're doing is you're using language for specific functions and structure naturally comes out of it. You realize structural aspects like if I have to say what is an adjective, it's not like I would first define and then I would give an example of a sentence where there is an adjective. It's actually the other way around. I keep using adjectives, I keep using context in which adjectives appear, and then I realize, okay, this is what is called an adjective. In terms of assessment, here under this approach, errors are seen as developmental process. You do not see errors as a deviation from the norm. Assessment does not focus on separate skills. It is as much as possible, it is integrated and everyday usage is allowed, and which is a very, very important part of it. Lastly, the learner's role is considered to be very, very active in knowledge creation under this, because you're not sticking to a particular structure. What is at the center of the whole learning is the learner. Language in all its forms is valued. Now, this is also something which is very important for us to realize when we talk about the general discourse of multilingualism and mother tongue, etc. The pedagogical implications would be that the interaction is as much learner-driven as curriculum and facilitator-driven. So if children decide that we do not like this poem because we do not understand its vocabulary, then the teacher or the facilitator chooses something else which they like, and possibly then they would come to the one which the teacher wants to do. There is a holistic approach. Now, this term is very, very important because it has been used multiple times in NAP 2020. Why do we say holistic? Holistic is something which is not looking at a particular level, which is not looking at a particular skill. You deal with everything at the same time, just like we do in real life. Like when I'm speaking to you right now, you are getting a sense of the things, you are deriving meaning out of it without looking at what kind of letters am I using? What kind of words am I using? What are the specific sentences I'm using? So you are taking a holistic meaning of what I'm saying right now. And that's exactly what we understand by a holistic approach. The impetus is on meaning. The impetus is on making language work for different kinds of functions rather than its different components. Now, because all the forms of language are valued, there is a wide variation in the resources used. So stories, folk songs, newspapers, advertisements, film songs, rhymes, and whatever way language is used in the society and the culture becomes a part of the pedagogy. The assessment, therefore, includes a detailed feedback because the pedagogy is learner driven. So you need to give a detailed feedback to the student. You do not give them just grades. You do not give them just marks. You do not just say that this is right or this is wrong. You give a detailed feedback. Possibly the learner also gives you some kind of feedback that he or she does not agree with you or does agree with you or whatever the learner wants to say. A variety of language skills and functions are assessed. It does not assess only certain kinds of grammatical components. It assesses your ability or your creativity in different contexts. So it's not like a particular, every student has to have n number of abilities or n number of skills in a particular area. So every individual might have certain kinds of skills and may not be very good at other kinds of skills. Now, having discussed about these two major approaches, we now come to the language perspectives in the context of NEP 2020. Because NEP 2020 tries to take, it's a very ambitious policy. It's a very ambitious document. It tries to bring in all that can be done, that should be done for envisaging a very positive outcome of education, in taking education very seriously for all sectors and for all sections of the society. So we need to see what is the kind of discourse which is taking place in this policy. Of course, NEP 2020 is not something which has come out of thin air. It is not something which is putting all these things for the first time in a document. There have been Kothari Commission, there have been education policies earlier also. We had it in 1986, and we had certain commissions which talked about different aspects, different dimensions of education, and in which also language played a very significant role. But in this, talking about NEP 2020, this particular document, what kind of perspective on language is more consistent with the discourse on language in NEP 2020? Let's see some of the key terms which are used in this document. The term holistic, we saw it appear in one of the two frameworks that we have seen, and that was the functionalist constructivist framework. This word has been used more than 30 times in the document. So for example, multidisciplinarity and a holistic education. This is referred to on page, this is written on page number 5. Now, and then learning should be holistic, integrated. Another word which has been used in the document and which is in line, in sync with our functionalist constructionist approach. Enjoyable and engaging, holistic and multidisciplinary. Again, we come to the same thing. The frequency of this word, holistic, what does it show? The policy envisages that the learning for any learner, the learning should not be divided into or dissected into certain components. It should be holistic, which gives a very, very holistic experience to the learner. Now, if you start dividing language itself into parts, if you start dividing linguistic skills into reading, writing, speaking, and listening separately, when we study them, when we research on them, it's a different question altogether. But when you start separating them out for the learner, that this is something to read, this is a topic to write on, this is a topic to be heard, this is something where we would just speak, and your ability to speak is being assessed. That means that we are dividing language into different kinds of components. That means you are disintegrating the experience of language of the learner. At the same time, when you are trying to say that, okay, now today we will do some grammar exercise, which is something very, very common. When you do grammar exercises, what do we mean by that? Is grammar different from text? Is grammar different from the normal usage that we have of language? If I gossip with my friend, am I not using grammar? Now, some of us might get into the purity of language here or the formality of language here. But formal does not mean grammatical, or informal does not mean ungrammatical. So we have to be very clear that when we are disintegrating, that's how we come to these kind of misconceptions that a particular kind of language is more right and a particular kind of language is wrong, because you're separating out grammar from text, from speech. Even a single sentence that a 3-year-old speaks is grammatical. If the child is saying mujhe bahar jana hai, what is ungrammatical in that? The order is right. The form of main, that is mujhe, which the child is speaking, is right. Like if the child says, I want to go out, what's wrong in that? There's nothing wrong. It's completely grammatical. So why do we want to focus on grammar separately? It has to be a holistic experience. It has to be a holistic learning. And when you see that the term holistic has been used more than 30 times in a document, which is about 65 pages long, or in effect 60 pages long, you see that every second page, this word is appearing at an average. So it has some meaning. And when we see that this term is reflecting a particular kind of framework, we obviously know that that is what is in sync with our NEP 2020 aims and goals. Then we come to this, and there is another key term, which is local or regional. So basically, this is used for local or regional languages. Most of the times it is used for languages, but it is also used for local context, local traditions, local languages, local teachers, language teachers, local community, local knowledge. The term has been so widespread in the whole document that it is actually used something like 80 times. I've written here more than 30 times, but I counted it later, it's about 80 times. The term regional is used 10 times in the document. Now, when we say local or regional, this means that we are giving space to not only local languages, but also local knowledge, local expressions, local idioms, local forms of expressions, local or regional. So here we almost mean the same thing when we are saying local or regional. So that means that the document finds it something very, very relevant when a word is appearing 80 times in a document of 60 pages. It's like almost every page has this word. Why is it so important? You are moving away from something which has been very, very generic to something which is suited to local needs. We are talking about local knowledge. We are talking about particularly in focus is local language. The colloquial use that we had seen earlier in one of the frameworks. Then there are there are usages like teachers must have knowledge of local languages. This is on page 20, and then there is another usage on page 9 that attention will be given to employing local teachers or those with familiarity with local languages. Then the framework will be developed in all the regional languages. So there is a lot of impetus on developing content, on developing frameworks, on translating things to local languages. And the need has been felt because a lot of languages are getting lost. Why are they getting lost? Because we want to stick to one mainstream language for everything. And why do we want to do that? Because we want to focus on the structure of the language. Because if the focus is on the function, we would not have this need of having just one language. If the focus is function, languages of all the learners will be respected. And that's exactly what you see reflected in NEP 2020. Diversity. So what we call variety and variation of linguistic forms or usages in the functionalist view of language, functionalist constructionist view of language. Here it is referred to as diversity. This term appears 11 times in the document and it is used in different kinds of contexts. Again, like diversity of languages, diversity of local context, diversity of knowledge forms, diversity in terms of resources, in terms of material. This is what we see in the whole document. Now, comparing this to which framework gives us this space for diversity? I think now the answer must be pretty clear by now. Then the term mother tongue. This had to be obviously there in the document because it has been a part of the policies, the erstwhile policies as well as this one. It is well understood that young children -- in their home language or mother tongue. So the basic point here was that every child understands things much better in their mother tongue. And if we stick to a particular structure and the learning of that structure, we cannot have space. We cannot give space to a lot of languages. And since we all know that India has more than 1,500 languages, at least more than 1,200 as per the latest census. So giving space to 1,200 languages would require a very, very different kind of framework. If you start focusing on the structure of language, you cannot give space to so many languages. And if you start giving space to mother tongues of the children, you will have to bring your focus from the structure to the function, to the expression of the child, to the idiosyncrasies, to the diverse forms that are there existing in your learners. So here is a chart, kind of a chart which gives an overall view of how many times the term language has been used 200 times in the whole document. And that shows the relevance of language in the whole discourse on education. The term local 81 times, diversity 11 times, regional 10 times, mother tongue 11 times, holistic 41 times. Now, there are certain ideas and concepts which have been discussed elaborately. NCPF ECCE, so basically the document and the document which talks about the early childhood care and education, mentions the need to include stories, poetry, games, songs. These resources for teaching have been mentioned in several places. In fact, the term story or storytelling has been used something like 10 times. Translation of scientific content and high quality learning material into Indian languages has been focused upon in a separate section. When we say Indian languages, again we are coming back to the local or the regional languages also. The relevance of multilingualism and the power of language. This is discussed in a separate section, which shows us how important a concept it is for a national policy on education. This is discussed on two full pages. It discusses the relevance of medium of instruction, which is home language, employing bilingual approach for teaching and material development. It also brings out the relevance of three language formula to enhance learning in mother tongue medium along with mainstream language. So uh, I'm talking about two languages here, but the three language formula, I think it's a well-known concept in the education policy in India. So we will not discuss more on this. Use of technology is also impressed upon to learn different languages and popularize language learning. Where this whole document is talking about language learning and the need to learn different languages, a need to translate things into different languages. Since the whole document is full of it, it again brings us back to the need and relevance of language, first of all, in terms of the whole discourse. And secondly, uh, it it impresses upon the need to have things in different languages, not in one particular mainstream language like in Hindi or in English. So basically it is asking for space for all the languages that are there as mother tongues of different speakers. Another long section, which is on page 53 and 54, it's devoted to the learning of languages as the key to understand cultural aspects. Now we come to, so it's not the behaviorist or the behaviorist structuralist view, which considers, which takes into its ambit the cultural aspects. It's actually the functionalist constructionist view. Language has been understood as in this particular section, it talks about these specific concepts. Language has been understood as a lens to see the world. This is basically linguistic relativity hypothesis, which is kind of elaborated in this section. An interesting discussion on the intricate patterns in language use has been brought out, like tones, intonations, pragmatic usages. So the policy is envisaging a discussion on the different aspects of language, which is something I find very interesting because this is not something that we usually focus on in our language pedagogy. Endangerment and extinction of languages due to their limited use has also been brought out, and it is a matter of concern for NEP 2020 that a lot of our regional and local languages are getting extinct. This is also a global concern. It's not just a concern in India, but why is it a concern in India? Because India has the maximum number of languages in a particular area. If it is more than 1500 languages, it is quite a big number out of something like more than 6000 languages. One fourth of the languages are found in India, around one fourth. And it is a matter of concern if impetus on a few languages is endangering and becoming a reason for extinction of the other local or regional languages. The experiential basis of language learning is also discussed at length in this particular section. So basically, this section is bringing about certain kinds of needs. And if you look at it carefully, that when you say language as a lens to see the world, basically you are talking about the relationship between language and thought. You're not talking about language as a structure. It's something which gives shape or which gives a particular lens to your thought. Then when you are talking about patterns in language use, you're obviously talking about the differences, the comparisons across different languages and the variety of languages that India has. Extinction and endangerment, when there is a concern about that, which means that you are trying to seek space for all those languages which are becoming extinct because they are no longer used. They are no longer used in the space of school, in the space of business, in the space of market, in the space of jobs. It's limited to home. And half the time now we do not stay at home. We're out of the homes. So it's asking for space for those languages. Experiential basis of language learning, of course, is something very important, and you find it in a particular framework and not in the other. Now I leave you with this discussion with something to deliberate upon, which is that if the key terms and elaborate discussions on certain linguistic issues in this particular document, NEP 2020, it clearly shows that a functionalist constructionist, instead of a behaviorist structuralist approach to understand language, its pedagogy and assessment, fulfills the aspirations raised in NEP 2020. But the question is not so simple. So is it like it's very simply, we have to choose the functionalist constructionist approach? Is it that simple to follow this approach? What exactly do we understand by it? What exactly does the policy NEP 2020 understand by such an approach? Even if we are full of aspirations, we want all the kids to be taught in their home languages. We want the languages to be saved. We want the learners to have a holistic experience. There should be an experiential basis to all kind of learning. But how practical, how pragmatic is it on the ground? And are we really even clear about what we understand by that? So we have to read, even for this policy, we have to read carefully between the lines whether the ambitious framework has really been thought through with respect to the pragmatic aspect. One example I'm taking here, where you can see a kind of a contradiction in the starting point of learning to read and write. So in the ECCE discussion, early childhood care and education, if you look at the discussion in that section, it clearly says that the learning of alphabets is important. So in the age group of 3 to 6 years, you start with learning alphabets. On the other hand, it also says that a lot of storytelling, poem recitation, etc. should be done. Are we really looking at the two with the same lens? Like if you start with the alphabets, it again comes back to the same paradigm. It again comes back to the same framework. What does an alphabet mean for a child? When we say that they should learn the alphabets, then whether or not we mean it, what we will come to is actually memorizing the alphabets. Are we really planning to do that? Do we really mean to do that? Along with having stories, along with having poems. So we are saying two things belonging to two different frameworks at the same time. Hence, I think it's very important that we read it very carefully, and wherever there are contradictions, we try to sort of sort them out in our own pedagogy. We have to be very careful as teachers. We need to be very careful to read that. It all looks very good. Yes, we want all the learners to learn their home languages. Where do we get the teachers from? One teacher cannot know the home language of 50 children or even 5 children. How can we expect that? So what do we do about it? Can we have an assessment which takes care of these kind of pedagogical approaches, where home languages are taken care of, but in the assessment, are we going to assess the child in those languages, or are we going to assess different children in the same mainstream language? If assessment does not follow our pedagogical approaches, then what is the point of teaching in a particular way and assessing in a different way? I leave you with that deliberation to make, and thank you for listening to me for one long hour. Thank you very much.